Good afternoon. The Gaza crisis deepens as civilians endure unimaginable suffering under relentless bombardment. Israeli streets now echo with protests demanding a ceasefire and accountability from Netanyahu's government. At the same time, international mediators are scrambling to broker a deal. Today, we delve into the human toll, the rising calls for peace, and whether diplomatic efforts can finally halt the devastation. Welcome to In Depth. The Times of Israel discussed a recent poll revealing that the majority of Israelis support a potential agreement to end Israel's ongoing war against Gaza, provided it leads to the release of all detainees. According to the poll, 72% of Israelis favour a deal in which around 30 detainees are freed in exchange for a 60-day ceasefire. However, it is notable that the deal does not propose a full and permanent ceasefire, as Israel remains resistant to ending the war on Gaza. The newspaper reported that Netanyahu, who is embroiled in a corruption trial, has also sought to delay his testimony due to the ongoing war. Public opinion is divided on his trial, with a significant portion of respondents expressing a desire for it to be resolved through a plea deal, while some favour his departure from politics. And providing further analysis for us now, we are joined from New York by Dr. P.L. De Silva, a strategic studies professor. Thank you very much for being here with us on Q News. So what do you make of the growing public pressure in Israel for perhaps a ceasefire, maybe temporary, but the detainee release as well?
So the thing is this, it has taken us, 14 months to get to this point. So 45,000 civilians have been killed, Palestinians. 70% of them are women and children. The number of child amputees is staggering. And my point is that it's too little, too late. And I have no belief that the Knesset and the Netanyahu government would actually go through with this. And even if they do, what's the point of a 60-day ceasefire if you're going to start up all over again? So the question is, where is the humanity in Israel, despite the 72% of people who would like to see an end to the bombing of civilians in Gaza?
And Dr. De Silva, how much influence do you think the US could have on Israel in securing a ceasefire? It doesn't seem to have had much success so far.
So we are in a lame duck phase of the Biden administration. So he's sending, Blinken running around the Middle East to try and secure a ceasefire in Gaza. But also we have to look at the West Bank, we have to look at East Jerusalem, we have to look at all of those places where I think almost 1,000 people have been, civilians have been killed in the West Bank. So how on earth is President Biden in his lame duck face going to pressure the Israeli government, the Netanyahu government, when he was unable to do so prior to the November presidential elections? I think it's highly doubtful, and we will have to wait for a Trump presidency come January 20th and see what we have in store for the beleaguered Palestinians.
And when it comes to a ceasefire, do you see any real possibility of a ceasefire? Or are these talks that occasionally take place, is it just a political maneuver on the part of Israel?
I mean, the facts speak for themselves. We've been talking ceasefire, permanent ceasefire, temporary ceasefire for 14, not 14 months, but it's been going on for a long time. But the facts on the ground is that people are dying every day, 10, 20, 50, 100, and there's no end to it. There's no respite. I mean, 2,000-pound bombs are being dropped on tents, for God's sake. And there doesn't seem to be anything. And I really don't see the end game that Israel has in mind, unless they want to totally cleanse, ethnically cleanse Gaza, and then grab the offshore oil and gas reserves. I think that's the only rational, you know, reason for all of this carnage.
And also, Dr. De Silva, reports suggest a limited detainee swap and a temporary ceasefire, as we've discussed. How do you think that will go down with the Israeli public?
It would go down extremely well, but unfortunately, the Netanyahu government has been stalling after the first swap took place. Many of the detainees who got killed need not have died, but they were also under bombardment, and it's really a crying shame. I mean, we know Rabbi Burton here in New York, and his cousin was one of those detainees who died. And none of them are very happy with the way that the Netanyahu government has gone about it, because they've been actually playing fast and loose with the lives of the hostages, and they've been totally disingenuous.
Okay, well, we're going to come back and talk further, Dr. De Silva, and we're hoping that a political science professor from Ramallah will be joining us as well. But before we continue, we're going to take a short break to have a look at how close is the agreement between Hamas and Israel, and can the suffering in Gaza finally come to an end? Here's a special report.
Efforts to finalize a ceasefire agreement between Palestinian resistance and Israel are reportedly gaining momentum, according to various sources. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has stressed the urgency of delivering humanitarian aid to Gaza, particularly as winter approaches, during high-level talks with U.S. officials. Egypt continues to play a pivotal role as a mediator, using its regional influence to advance discussions on a potential detainee exchange and ceasefire. Reports indicate that the proposed agreement may involve a phased release of detainees held by both sides, beginning with a humanitarian ceasefire lasting up to 7 weeks. However, the situation remains complex. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu faces mounting domestic pressure. Thousands of Israelis recently protested in Tel Aviv, demanding the return of detainees and an end to hostilities. At the same time, skepticism about Netanyahu's leadership persists, with polls revealing public doubt over his handling of the war and ongoing corruption trials. The potential agreement could mark a turning point, yet analysts warn that fragile trust and political calculations could still derail progress. As Egypt continues to advocate for peace and stability, the world watches closely for signs that the suffering in Gaza might finally subside.
So we are still joined by a strategic studies professor from New York, Dr. P.L. De Silva. Thank you very much for staying with us, Dr. De Silva. So you mentioned it before, Trump is returning to office. How do you think Israel will adjust its Middle East strategy, particularly regarding Gaza, when with a Trump administration?
So the thing is this, Trump is much more popular among Netanyahu's supporters than Netanyahu himself. So he does have significant leverage in that case. And Trump has always said or hinted that he would like to be a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. So I am hopeful in that sense, just because of who Mr. Trump is, that he would actually try to make an effort to bring about, an end to war, hopefully, in the Palestinian territories, the occupied territories. So we just have to wait and see. Nobody can read the tea leaves when it comes to the mercurial Mr. Trump.
So basically, he could perhaps attain some kind of peace, even if it is just for himself to get a Nobel Peace Prize. Okay, well,
Right.
what about Israel's extensions of its activities? Israel's extension, of course, of its occupation in Syria. Does this impact the chances of a lasting peace in Gaza?
I think that's separate. Gaza, Israel is going to go on squeezing and squeezing and bombing and totally destroying, and Israeli contractors flattening whole neighborhoods. The Syrian target is a target of opportunity for the Israelis. They've taken the Golan, they've taken the mountain, they've taken the southwestern parts of Syria. But by overplaying his hand, Netanyahu might actually ensure that the Russians stay, because HTS might think it's better to have the Russians stay in Syria than leave, because we are at the mercy of a rampant militaristic settler colony in Israel. So yeah, this is also something that's playing out now. The Russians are trying to stay on and talking directly to the HTS, and we'll have to wait and see.
Well, a Channel 12 poll shows that most Israelis support ending the war and releasing the detainees, as we've mentioned before, and this 60-day ceasefire. So he's got people on the streets protesting in Tel Aviv. Do you think Netanyahu cares about this? Would it make a difference to how the Israeli government responds?
See, the whole point is about Netanyahu, another character like Trump. He only cares about himself. And a lot of this continuation of all this carnage and misery all around him is to keep himself out of harm's way with regard to the corruption trials, with regard to the mishandling, leading up to, last year in October 7th. So these are all things that Netanyahu is doing, and he's got a vociferous group of supporters inside the Knesset from the far right in Israel, and they are replicating, you know, awful atrocities that we saw happening during World War II when the Nazis were dishing it out to a hapless, Jewish population. And this is pretty much again the same thing that's happening. The Israelis are dishing it out to a hapless Palestinian population.
Now, with steps being taken by the international community, sorry, what are the steps being taken by the international community, rather, to try and ensure a ceasefire? Not just the United States, but of course Europe and other nations as well. How important is the international community in trying to get a ceasefire not only reached, but also maintained as well?
So the thing is this. These are the very same countries, right? The United States and a number of European countries that are also arming the Israeli military machine. So it's kind of hypocritical, on the one hand calling for peace and ceasefire and things like that, but at the same time arming Israel to the teeth. And these weapons, these battlefield weapons, are being used against civilians living in tents. These are clear, war crimes, crimes against international humanitarian law, atrocity crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of aggression that Israel stands accused of. And we can see it playing out in real time on our TV screens.
Well, we're going to now be joined by Dr. Khalid Dawood, who's joining us, who's an expert in these matters as well. Thank you for joining our conversation. Dr. Dawood, can I ask you about some of the things that I've been asking Dr. De Silva about? Israeli officials are saying that they're cautiously optimistic about a deal. Do you think terms like a 60-day ceasefire and also a return of the detainees will end the violence in Gaza?
Well, good afternoon, first of all. Thanks for having me. I mean, unfortunately, we still have a long way ahead before we can say that we are reaching a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. I mean, probably the proposals that are being circulated right now are not very different from what was being discussed back in August, which is to have a temporary sort of ceasefire in order to satisfy Netanyahu's insistence that it's not going to be a permanent ceasefire. And if the first 60 days succeeded in maintaining the calm and some sort of an exchange of prisoners happened between the Israelis and the Palestinians, maybe this could lead to more successful negotiations towards a permanent ceasefire agreement. Of course, there are many issues that are complicated and that remain a matter of discussion between the Israelis and the mediating parties, namely the United States, Qatar, and Egypt, concerning the number of hostages that are going to be released and how many Palestinians are also going to be released in return. And of course, one key sticking point is the one in relation to how fast the Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip would be taking place, because I mean, Hamas has insisted for a very long time that it's not going to be satisfied with a temporary kind of truce, and they want a time schedule, an exact the time schedule for the full Israeli withdrawal from the occupied Gaza Strip. However, I mean, indications and a few leakages that are taking place so far are basically implying that maybe everything would still wait for the new U.S. administration to come in, namely President Trump taking over office on January 20, because, again, we've seen one phone call happening yesterday between Netanyahu and the President-elect Trump, indicating again that despite the fact that it officially right now remains to be Biden administration in office and Jack Sullivan and Mr. Blinken touring the region in order to speak about Syria and to speak about Palestine, but the reality is, in like almost a month, we're going to have a new administration with a different president, with a different attitude. And again, maybe the Israelis are hoping that even if they reach or announce some sort of a temporary ceasefire ahead of Trump's taking over, he would be more understanding of maintaining some sort of a military presence in Gaza for some time to come, until the key issue about the day after, which is again another sticking point, who's going to be responsible for Gaza after the war comes to a relative end. Of course, if some sort of an agreement is reached, including Egypt and including Qatar, on the formation of some sort of a new body that will be responsible for running Gaza and equally important to receive the outside international assistance, this would be very helpful to move a step forward. But if Mr. Netanyahu continues to insist that he's not going to allow either Hamas or even the PA, so it's a kind of a catch-22, because who else exists? All the previous attempts to find some local families, some local, Gazans to run this administration has failed. So, again, the flexibility is required from the Israeli side concerning the day after.
It does indeed seem like Joe Biden is the lamest of lame ducks right now. We remains to be seen what will happen when Trump arrives on January 20th. What are the I'll stay with you, Dr. Dawood. What do you think are the implications of the Tel Aviv protest demanding a ceasefire? Does it have an effect on Netanyahu's political future? Will it change anything?
Well, I guess, objectively speaking, the Israelis are now in a state of euphoria, you might call it this way. Because again, after more than a year, of the October 7 attacks led by Hamas, and after the Israelis seeming squeezed within Gaza itself, of course, Netanyahu managed to turn the tables by starting a new war against Lebanon, which led to the death and the killing of the former Secretary General, the late Secretary General of Hezbollah, Mr. Hassan Nasrallah. And after that, of course, which was a very important development, because again, this meant that at least the Israeli Prime Minister achieved this business of separating between the fronts. It's no longer that the Lebanese Hezbollah is supporting the Palestinians in Gaza by continuing to attack Israel. So this has come to an end. And of course, the biggest prize and a calming message to the Israeli Prime Minister came after the downfall of the Syrian regime that played a very important role in providing weapons to Hezbollah and to other resistance groups in cooperation with Iran. So Iran is no longer in Syria. The Syrian regime itself, the former regime of President Bashar Assad, is no longer there. So again, those are among the factors that leads to this increasing calls within the Israeli society that now is the right time to reach that kind of ceasefire agreement, while Netanyahu at the same time feels victorious. There is no question from the beginning. Everybody's been speaking about how Netanyahu is trying to delay any sort of agreement because the more the war, the longer the war goes on, this assures that Mr. Netanyahu and his right-wing coalition will continue to remain in office.
Okay.
So now, perhaps after all those the alleged victories that Mr. Netanyahu sees happening, this would encourage him, and together with the Trump arrival into the White House, this would encourage him to reach a sort of a temporary ceasefire, again, at least to stop the bloodshed for a while, to give the Israeli army a respite and a chance to rearm itself before we see other developments happening on the ground when Mr. Trump comes into office.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Dawood. I'll come back to you, Dr. De Silva. What steps do you think the international community can take to address the dire humanitarian crisis in Gaza amidst this ongoing violence? Dr. De Silva, can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Oh, I didn't know that the question
Yeah,
was
that's for you.
addressed to me.
Yeah, what steps do you think the international community can take to address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza?
So the international community, the work that is being done by UNRWA, the phenomenal work, they've lost hundreds of their colleagues. I think 250 have been killed. They're the ones that produce the bulk of the support for the beleaguered Palestinian people. And the Israeli Knesset has voted that UNRWA is going to cease operations in Israel and the occupied territories come the end of January. How that will play out needs to be seen. But if UNRWA is taken out of the equation, I don't see any other UN entity, whether it's the World Food Program, UNHCR, UNDP, any of these other players would be able to fill that gap. And that is to the detriment and the well-being of the Palestinian peoples, and especially the children. UNICEF, Save the Children, they are all trying their best, but they have been, I think, for 2 weeks, there's been no aid going in at all. And the northern part of Gaza has been under total blockade without anything going in. So it is just absolutely atrocious. And as long as the Israelis keep blocking, there is very little that the international community can do, because Israel is the host country and it is the occupying power. If the international community fails to provide, then under international law, the onus falls on the occupying power, and that is Israel, and it will be Israel's responsibility to care for the Palestinian people. And I don't see that happening either. So we're in a very dark, dystopian place.
Okay. And coming back to you, Khalid Dawood, how can both sides ensure that any deal reached benefits civilians rather than exacerbates the political stalemate that we have at the moment? Khalid Dawood, can you hear me? I was wanting to ask how you think that both sides might ensure that any deal that's reached benefits civilians rather than exacerbates the political stalemate. I'll ask the question to you, actually. Let me come on to something else for you, Dr. De Silva, because we just seem to have lost Mr. Dawood. What challenges do mediators face in reaching some kind of lasting peace agreement?
So the mediators in the current situation who are closest to the action are the Qataris and the Egyptians. And both countries and their mediators have been pleading with the Israelis and trying to convince them that something's got to give, that we need a ceasefire, we need a permanent ceasefire. Whether the Israelis are negotiating in good faith or not remains to be seen. I believe that they're not negotiating in good faith. And therefore, the work is cut out for the regional mediators, Qatar and Egypt. And then we discussed about the US, what impact a lame duck Biden administration has in getting the Netanyahu government to acquiesce. And that is not on the cards either. So I think, unfortunately, we've got to wait till January, end of January, to see how all of this is going to play out.
Thank you very much indeed for joining me here on the program. Dr. P.L. De Silva, a strategic studies professor, joining us from New York. And also thank you to Mr. Khalid Dawood, the editorial manager at Al Ahram Weekly, joining us from Cairo. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of In Depth. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for more updates here on Q News.